The shell came through the operating theatre wall at 3:30 in the morning. Plaster dust fell like snow onto the open abdomen of a Royal Norfolk private, and Lieutenant Colonel Cyril Wadsworth Whitfield, his hands inside the man's belly, did not look up. He could not look up. The young soldier was bleeding from the splenic artery, and if Whitfield's gloved fingers slipped now, the boy would be dead in 90 seconds. Somewhere beyond the sandbagged windows of the Alexandra Military Hospital at Singapore, a Japanese mortar team was walking rounds across the cricket pitch, methodically, almost lazily, as though no one inside the white-painted colonial building deserved their full attention. It was February 14th, 1942. The hospital sat behind the British perimeter, barely. The Imperial Japanese Army's 18th Division had crossed the Singapore Straits a week earlier, and General Yamashita's tanks were now less than half a mile from the wards. Inside those wards lay 900 men, gangrenous, dysenteric, tubercular, blast-wounded, blinded. Below them, in the basement, 200 more lay on stretchers laid directly on the concrete. The water mains had failed at noon. The electrical generator was running on the last of the diesel the Royal Army Medical Corps had managed to siphon from an abandoned ambulance. And Whitfield, a Yorkshireman, 41 years old, a surgeon at Leeds General Infirmary before the war, was about to begin the longest day of his life. He had already been operating for 26 hours. He would operate for another 72. What happened over the next 3 days inside the Alexandra Hospital became one of the most carefully buried episodes of the Far Eastern War. The Cabinet Office sealed the relevant files for 50 years. The War Office discouraged survivors from speaking. Even Mountbatten, when he returned to Singapore in 1945, asked the senior medical officer present for a quiet report, just to me. There were reasons for that silence. Some were operational, some were diplomatic, some, frankly, were shameful. Not on Whitfield's part, but on the part of those in Whitehall who had promised that Singapore was an impregnable fortress and who now needed the catastrophe of its fall packaged neatly for public consumption. But Whitfield's 3 days under fire would not be packaged neatly. They could not be. Because what he did inside that hospital, the decisions he made, the patients he chose to operate on, and the ones he chose to let die, the moment he stood in the corridor and faced a Japanese officer with a bloodied scalpel still in his hand, would alter the course of British military medicine, would shape the way the army treated battlefield casualties for the next 30 years, and would eventually result in a knighthood quietly conferred in 1957 with no public ceremony and no announcement in the London Gazette beyond a single line. This is the story of how one British surgeon, abandoned by his chain of command, betrayed by his own government's strategic delusions, and surrounded by an enemy infamous for its treatment of the wounded, performed 41 major operations in 72 hours without sleep, without anaesthetic for the last 18, and without ever leaving the building. It is also the story of what Britain knew, what Britain hid, and what we are only now, 84 years on, able to tell in full. Because the truth about the Alexandra Hospital is darker than the myth, and it is more remarkable. Stay with me. To understand what Whitfield walked into, you must first understand the broader catastrophe that was British strategy east of Suez in the winter of 1941. For 2 decades, Singapore had been sold to the British public, and, more dangerously, to the British government, as the unshakable anchor of imperial defence in the Far East. The naval base had cost £60 million. The guns at Changi were the largest coastal artillery pieces the Empire had ever installed. Successive First Sea Lords had assured the Cabinet that if war ever came with Japan, the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet would steam from Scapa Flow or Gibraltar within 70 days and break any siege. The plan was called Main Fleet to Singapore, and it was the central assumption of British grand strategy in Asia from 1922 until almost the moment the bombs began to fall. It was nonsense. It had been nonsense since at least 1937, when the Joint Planning Committee privately admitted in a paper now held at the National Archives in Kew that no such fleet could be spared so long as the German and Italian navies threatened the home waters and the Mediterranean. But the fiction had been allowed to persist because the alternative, admitting that the Empire could not, in fact, defend itself everywhere at once, was politically unthinkable. The Australian and New Zealand governments had been told repeatedly that Singapore would hold. Whitehall could not now say otherwise without unravelling the entire imperial compact. Churchill, characteristically, had compounded the problem. In November 1941, against the explicit advice of Admiral Pound and the Chiefs of Staff, he had dispatched Force Z, the battleship Prince of Wales, the battlecruiser Repulse, and 4 destroyers to Singapore as a deterrent. There was no aircraft carrier. HMS Indomitable, which was to have accompanied them, had run aground in the West Indies. Churchill, when warned of the absence of air cover, had remarked airily that the mere presence of 2 capital ships would be enough to give the Japanese pause. The Japanese, on December 10th, 1941, sank both ships in 70 minutes of bombing off Kuantan. 840 British and Commonwealth sailors drowned. It was the worst disaster the Royal Navy had suffered since the loss of HMS Hood 6 months earlier, and arguably the more strategically catastrophic of the two. Britain had no fleet east of Ceylon. The promise to Singapore had been broken before the campaign had even properly begun. The land defence was no better. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the GOC Malaya Command, had 88,000 men under his command, British, Indian, Australian, and locally raised forces. But they were dispersed across a peninsula 600 miles long, with no armour to speak of. Obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters that the Japanese Zeros knocked from the sky almost contemptuously, and a defensive doctrine premised on the assumption that no enemy would ever come down the Malayan jungle from the north because the jungle was deemed impenetrable. The Japanese, on bicycles, found it perfectly penetrable. They covered 600 miles in 55 days. Meanwhile, in London, the War Cabinet was preoccupied with the Atlantic, with the relief of Tobruk, with the Soviet collapse around Moscow, and with the still fresh shock of Pearl Harbor. The Far East was, in Sir Alan Brooke's private diary, a secondary theatre about which we can do nothing whatever. Singapore was, in effect, written off in Whitehall before the first Japanese soldier set foot on the island. The men inside the perimeter, including Whitfield, did not know this. They had been told repeatedly that relief was coming. It was not coming. And by February 8th, when Yamashita's troops crossed the Johor Straits in inflatable boats under cover of darkness, the only question left was how the end would come, and at what cost. Cyril Whitfield was not, by background or temperament, the obvious man for a last stand. He had been born in Halifax in 1900, the son of a wool merchant, and had won a scholarship to Leeds Grammar School and then to Cambridge to read medicine. He had qualified in 1924, taken his fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1929, and by 1938 was a consultant at Leeds General Infirmary with a quiet specialism in abdominal trauma, a field of medicine that in peacetime Yorkshire mostly meant farm accidents and the occasional miner crushed in a roof fall. He had a wife, Margaret, a daughter aged 11, and a fondness for fly fishing on the wharf. He had joined the Royal Army Medical Corps Reserve in 1937, more from a sense of obligation than any martial enthusiasm, after hearing Anthony Eden speak at a Conservative dinner about the gathering crisis in Europe. Called up in September 1939, he had served first at the British Military Hospital in Catterick, then with the British Expeditionary Force in France, where he had been evacuated from Dunkirk aboard a Margate paddle steamer with what he later described in a letter to his wife as a great quantity of other people's blood on my trousers and not, mercifully, any of my own. He had been mentioned in dispatches for his work in the casualty clearing station at Hazebrook and posted in late 1940 to the Far East. He arrived at the Alexandra Hospital in March 1941. The building itself was barely 3 years old, a long, low, white colonial structure on the southern flank of the island, set among palms and bougainvillea, with airy wards and ceiling fans and a view of the Straits. Whitfield's letters home in the spring of 1941 are remarkable, mostly for their tedium. He grumbled about the heat. He complained about the gin. He noted, with the dryness of his class and profession, that the social life of British Singapore was approximately what one would expect at a Lancashire golf club on a wet Sunday, only with more racism. The man he answered to was Lieutenant Colonel Julian Craven, the commanding officer of the Alexandra, a regular army doctor, RAMC since 1919, who had served in Mesopotamia and on the northwest frontier. Craven was a competent administrator, but, by Whitfield's private account, not a forceful personality. The senior matron, Mary Hellier, a New Zealander who had worked at St. Bartholomew's in London before transferring to the colonial service, was by all accounts the steel that held the hospital together. Set against them, the figure beginning to crystallize on the other side of the straits was Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, as the British press would soon christen him, more in fear than in admiration. Yamashita was a methodical, ruthless commander who had studied in Germany and Switzerland in the 1920s and had been an attaché in Vienna at the time of the Anschluss. He understood Western military thinking intimately. He also understood that his own logistics were perilously thin, and that his only hope of taking Singapore was to bluff Percival into surrender before the bluff was called. But Yamashita's army contained, embedded within the 18th Division, units whose conduct in China had already passed into infamy. The Imperial General Staff in Tokyo had issued no clear directive on the treatment of prisoners or wounded combatants. In practice, what happened depended entirely on the local commander and on the temper of the men he led. By February 1942, after weeks of jungle fighting and mounting casualties, the temper of those men was murderous. On February 13th, advance elements of the Japanese 18th began moving along the Pasir Panjang Ridge. The Alexandra Hospital lay directly in their path. Craven asked Whitfield to come to his office at 6 o'clock that evening. Something, he said, had to be decided about the patients. The conversation in Craven's office that evening was, by Whitfield's later testimony to the War Crimes Commission in 1946, the most difficult of his professional life. There were 912 patients in the Alexandra. Of those, Craven explained, perhaps 300 could walk. Another 200 could be moved on stretchers if transport could be found. The remaining 412 were post-surgical, critically ill, or otherwise immovable. Headquarters, by which Craven meant Percival's command at Fort Canning, had ordered no evacuation. The hospital was to remain in place. It would be, the order stated, respected as a medical facility under the Geneva Conventions. A Red Cross flag had been raised that afternoon on the main flagstaff and on the roof of each wing. 2 more were laid across the lawn, large enough to be seen from the air. Whitfield asked Craven directly whether he believed the Japanese would honor the flag. Craven said he believed they would. Whitfield, in his diary that night, the diary survives in the Imperial War Museum's documents collection at Lambeth Road, catalogue reference 67/430/1, wrote a single line beneath the date. JC believes the flag will be honoured. I do not. Have told no one. Will operate through the night. He went back to the theatre at 7:30. He did not leave the building except briefly to visit the latrine for the next 96 hours. The first patient on the evening of the 13th was a Gordon Highlander corporal with a shrapnel wound to the liver. Whitfield resected the damaged lobe, packed the cavity, and closed. The second was an Australian sapper with a compound fracture of the femur and the beginnings of gas gangrene. Whitfield amputated above the knee. The third was a Malay civilian, a hospital cook who had been hit by mortar fragments while bringing rice to the wards. Whitfield removed the spleen and 3 feet of small intestine and prayed. By dawn on the 14th, he had operated on 11 men. By noon, the Japanese mortar fire had begun in earnest. By the early afternoon, the artillery rounds were coming through the upper walls. It was at this point, 3:30 on the afternoon of February 14th, that the 1st Japanese Infantry Detachment, a platoon of perhaps 30 men under a young lieutenant whose name has never been established with certainty, broke through the perimeter fence at the southern end of the hospital grounds. They were observed by Sister Margaret MacLeod from the upper window of the officers' ward. She telephoned the front office. The orderly who took the call, Lance Corporal Henry Toos, RAMC, age 19, ran to the front entrance with a white sheet on a broom handle and shouted, in the few words of Japanese he had been taught, that this was a hospital. He was bayoneted in the doorway. The sheet fell into the rhododendrons. What followed over the next 90 minutes is documented in detail in the surviving testimony of 7 witnesses, deposited in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, the IWM in London, and the National Archives at Kew under file WO 235/1015. The Japanese platoon entered the hospital. They bayoneted patients in their beds. They bayoneted the priest, Reverend Hugh Bevan, at the altar of the chapel where he was administering communion to a dying Welsh guardsman. They bayoneted Captain Smiley of the RAMC, who came out of an operating theatre with his hands raised and a bloody scalpel in his right. They came down the corridor towards the main surgical theatre, where Whitfield was operating on a Sikh sergeant of the 5/11th Frontier Force Rifles. He heard them coming. He did not stop operating. The door of the main theatre was a heavy mahogany piece set deep in the colonial frame, and Sister Helia had locked it from the inside at the first sound of screaming from the eastern corridor. She had then placed herself with her back against it, a bottle of ether held by the neck like a club, and told the 2 RAMC orderlies in the theatre, Privates Davies and Forsyth, to do whatever was necessary if the door gave way. Whitfield, at the table, his hands inside the abdomen of Sergeant Daljit Singh, said nothing. The anaesthetist, a Eurasian doctor named Dr. Lim Boon Keng, who had volunteered with the hospital only 6 weeks earlier, kept the chloroform mask in place and his eyes on the gauge. The Japanese reached the door at approximately 4:15. They struck it with rifle butts. The frame held. They shouted in Japanese. Helia did not answer. They fired 3 rounds through the panel, splintering the upper section. 1 bullet passed within a foot of Whitfield's head and embedded itself in the tiled wall above the autoclave. He did not look up. He has described what happened next in only one document. A private letter, written in 1953 to his daughter Elizabeth when she was a student at Girton, and now held at the Churchill Archive Centre in Cambridge under his personal papers GBR/0014/WHFD. The letter is not long. The relevant passage reads, "I was holding the sergeant's bowel in my left hand. The bleeding from the mesenteric vessel had only just stopped. If I had let go to raise my hands, he would have died in my fingers. I did not know whether the Japanese would shoot me through the door, or break it down and bayonet me at the table, or simply leave. I decided, my dear, that it did not very much matter which. The bowel was the only thing in the world that mattered just then. I have thought about this many times since, and I do not think I was being brave. I think I was being a surgeon. The two are sometimes the same thing, and sometimes not. The Japanese did not break down the door. After perhaps 3 minutes, Hellyer later estimated 4, they moved on, down the corridor, towards the basement. What followed in the basement is the single worst recorded atrocity of the Singapore campaign, and there is no purpose served in rehearsing its details here. It is enough to say that of the 200 patients lying on stretchers on the concrete floor, approximately 140 were killed within the next 40 minutes, along with the medical orderlies attempting to shield them. The men who survived did so because they were buried beneath the bodies of those who did not. Whitfield finished operating on Sergeant Singh at 6 o'clock. The sergeant survived. He was repatriated to the Punjab in 1946 and lived until 1974. Whitfield then washed his hands, changed his gloves, and began on the next case. There were, by Sister Hellyer's count, 38 men still alive in the upper wards who required immediate surgery. Whitfield operated on all 38 over the next 66 hours. He did so under intermittent shell fire, with the electricity failing twice, with the last of the anaesthetic running out on the afternoon of the 16th, and with the knowledge, confirmed when he finally permitted himself to leave the theatre at noon on February 17th, that more than 400 of his patients and 17 of his medical staff had been killed in the corridors and basement of the hospital where he had been working. He sat down in the matron's office. He drank a cup of tea. He asked Sister Hellyer very quietly whether anyone had counted the dead. She said they were still counting. The official War Office casualty return for the Alexandra Hospital massacre, compiled in October 1945 by Major Cyril Wilde, the same officer who had carried the white flag for Percival's surrender party 3 days later, recorded 323 confirmed deaths and 108 further men missing, presumed killed in the building. The true figure was almost certainly higher. Wilde noted in his covering memorandum, declassified in 1995 and now held at Kew under WO 325/56, that we have no proper record of the Malay and Indian civilian patients, the auxiliary nursing staff, or the kitchen and laundry personnel, who were almost wholly Asiatic and whose deaths were not recorded in the British returns. Of 41 medical officers and nursing sisters on duty at the Alexandra on the afternoon of February 14th, 23 were killed. The cost to the British Empire of the wider Singapore campaign was, of course, very much larger. Approximately 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops went into Japanese captivity on February 15th, 1942. Of those, somewhere between a quarter and a third would not return. The figures remain disputed because the Japanese kept no consistent records, and the survivors, when they came home in 1945, were ordered by the War Office to sign undertakings not to discuss their treatment publicly. The official histories, when they appeared in the 1950s under the editorship of Major General S. Woodburn Kirby, were heavily redacted on the question of medical conduct. Kirby's first draft of Volume 1 of the War Against Japan, submitted in 1953, was returned by the Cabinet Office with 127 separate redactions, of which 43 concerned the Alexandra Hospital alone. Why? Two reasons, and both reveal something uncomfortable about post-war Britain. The first was diplomatic. By 1953, Japan was rearming under American auspices as a Cold War ally against Communist China and the Soviet Union. The Foreign Office, then under Sir Anthony Eden, took the view, recorded in a paper marked secret and held at Kew under FO 371/1 05434, that the publication of detailed accounts of Japanese atrocities against British medical personnel would complicate Her Majesty's government's necessary cooperation with Tokyo in the present strategic situation. Eden personally approved the redactions. He did not consult the families of the dead. The second reason was, if anything, more uncomfortable. The fall of Singapore was already, by 1945, what Churchill himself had called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Any detailed account of the Alexandra inevitably raised questions about why Percival had not evacuated the hospital, why the Red Cross flag had been deemed sufficient protection by a command structure that had been receiving intelligence reports of Japanese conduct in Hong Kong since Christmas Day 1941, and, most awkwardly, why Whitehall had continued to assure the Australian government, as late as February 10th, that the situation on the island was stabilising. There was no public inquiry. The Cabinet Singapore Committee, established in 1946 under Lord Justice du Parc, reported in 1948 and recommended that, in the interests of national morale and continued imperial cohesion, the full findings should remain classified for 50 years. They were duly sealed until 1998. For Whitfield personally, the cost was different and harder to measure. He survived the next 3.5 years as a prisoner at Changi and then at the Sime Road camp, where he continued, with extraordinarily limited equipment, to operate on his fellow prisoners. He performed, according to the post-war reckoning of his colleague Captain Robert Hardy, over 600 further procedures in captivity, using sharpened bamboo for retractors and pawpaw juice as an antiseptic. He came home in October 1945. He weighed 7 stone 4 pounds. He did not speak about the Alexandra to his wife. He did not speak about it to his daughter. He returned to Leeds, resumed his consultancy, and worked for another 23 years. The immediate post-war consequences of the Alexandra Hospital affair were curiously muted, and that mutedness was itself a deliberate choice by the British state. When the War Crimes Tribunal convened in Singapore in 1946, 3 Japanese officers were eventually tried in connection with the Alexandra. 2 were hanged at Changi Jail in March 1947. The third, who had served only as a junior lieutenant in the bayoneting party, received a 15-year sentence and was quietly released by the new Japanese government in 1953 as part of the broader Allied Japanese rapprochement. Yamashita himself was hanged by the Americans in Manila in February 1946, though for crimes in the Philippines rather than at Singapore. The Alexandra never received its own dedicated tribunal. There were, the Judge Advocate General's Department concluded, evidentiary difficulties, a euphemism, in practice, for the fact that most of the perpetrators were dead, unidentifiable, or had been absorbed back into the new pro-Western Japanese establishment. The strategic consequences were more lasting and more significant. The fall of Singapore destroyed the credibility of British imperial defence in Asia forever. Australia, which had lost the entire 8th Division in the capitulation, turned decisively towards the United States. The ANZUS Treaty of 1951, which deliberately excluded Britain, can be traced directly to the broken promises of February 1942. Mr. Curtin, the Australian Prime Minister, had said as much in his famous New Year message of 1942. Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links of kinship with the United Kingdom. Those words, delivered 6 weeks before the Alexandra, were the obituary of British imperial primacy in the Pacific. In Whitehall, the medical lessons of the campaign were absorbed more quickly and more honourably than the strategic ones. The RAMC's Forward Surgical Unit Doctrine. The principle that surgeons should operate as close to the front line as possible in self-contained mobile units capable of independent function was substantially rewritten in 1943 and 1944 on the basis of dispatches smuggled out of Changi by repatriated Red Cross personnel. Whitfield's own clinical notes, written on cigarette papers and toilet paper and concealed inside the false bottom of a medical chest, reached the War Office in 1944 via a Swedish exchange and were studied closely by Sir Hennig Ogilvie, the consulting surgeon to the Army. Many of the procedures Whitfield improvised at the Alexandra and at Changi, for compound abdominal wounds in particular, became standard RAMC practice in Korea, in Suez, in Aden, and in the Falklands. Whitfield himself received the OBE in 1946. It was, by the standards of what he had done, almost an insult. The matter was raised in the Honours Committee in 1949 and again in 1953. On both occasions, the recommendation for a higher decoration was blocked by the Foreign Office on the grounds that any elevation would draw unwelcome attention to events Whitehall preferred to keep buried. Eventually, in 1957, after a private intervention by Lord Mountbatten, who had served as Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia and who, in retirement, took a personal interest in the rehabilitation of forgotten Far Eastern veterans. Whitfield was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire. The investiture took place at Buckingham Palace on March 12th of that year. There was no announcement beyond a single line in the Gazette. The Queen, who was then 30 years old and had been on the throne for 5, spent 15 minutes with him in the Bow Room. What was said between them has never been recorded. He died in Harrogate in 1968 of pancreatic cancer, aged 68. His obituary in the Times ran to 4 paragraphs and did not mention the Alexandra at all. What, then, are we to make of Cyril Whitfield, and of the 72 hours he spent operating inside a building that had effectively been abandoned by the British state to its fate? There is a temptation, in any story of this kind, to reach for the consolations of heroism, to say that one good man redeemed an otherwise shameful episode, that British decency survived the collapse of British strategy, that the values of the RAMC outlived the failures of Fort Canning and Whitehall. There is some truth in all of that, but it is, I think, an incomplete truth, and Whitfield himself would have been the first to reject it. He was a Yorkshireman of the old school, suspicious of grand language and contemptuous of sentiment. When his daughter Elizabeth asked him in 1962 whether he considered himself a hero, he is recorded as having replied, "I considered myself extraordinarily lucky to have the use of both my hands. The men who didn't survive were no worse than I was. They were simply unluckier." The deeper lesson of the Alexandra is harder, and it concerns the cost paid by individuals, soldiers, doctors, nurses, civilians, when a government commits itself, for reasons of pride or politics or sheer institutional inertia, to defending the indefensible. Singapore was lost not in February 1942, but in the long decade of strategic self-deception that preceded it, when successive British cabinets allowed the fiction of imperial omnipotence to substitute for the painful arithmetic of imperial overstretch. The men who died on the basement floor of the Alexandra Hospital and the women who tried to shield them were not killed only by Japanese bayonets. They were killed, in a slower and more indirect way, by 20 years of decisions taken in rooms they would never enter, by men who would never know their names. This is, I think, the real reason the files were sealed for 50 years. It is why Eden approved Kirby's redactions in 1953. It is why Whitfield's knighthood was given quietly. The Alexandra was inconvenient not because of what the Japanese had done, but because of what its existence asked of the British political class. And the British political class, then as now, is not always good at being asked difficult questions. We are better, perhaps, at asking them now. The files are open. Whitfield's papers, his diary, his letter to Elizabeth are available to any researcher willing to make the journey to Cambridge or to Lambeth Road. Singapore itself, 84 years on, is one of the wealthiest nations on earth and remembers the fall and the Alexandra with a clear-eyed honesty that has sometimes shamed our own. The cricket pitch where the Japanese mortar team walked its rounds is now a public park. The hospital still stands. There is a small plaque inside the main entrance, in English and in Tamil and in Mandarin, which lists the names of the dead. Whitfield's name does not appear on it. He was, after all, one of the lucky ones. What do you make of his story? Was Britain right to keep these files closed for half a century, or was the silence itself a second betrayal of the men who died in that basement? Should Whitfield be better remembered? And if so, by whom? Let me know in the comments below. If this kind of carefully sourced British military history is what you come here for, please consider subscribing. There is a great deal more to tell, and a great many more forgotten men and women whose stories deserve the light. Thank you, as always, for watching.